Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Hey everyone, I'm Julie Gunlock, Director of the Culture of Alarmism Project at the Independent Women's Forum, and your host for today's Working for Women podcast. Today I'm here with Abby Schachter, a mom and Pittsburgh-based writer. She's a regular contributor to the Weekly Standard, Acculturated, the Wall Street Journal, the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, and Reason Magazine, just to name a few. Abby is also the author of a new book called No Child Left Alone, Getting the Government Out of Parenting. She explores the growing problem of government nannies, telling parents what's best for their families, whether it's to allow children to go unchaperoned to play in the park, to play Pokemon Go, what food they should be feeding their kids, even whether to breastfeed or bottle feed. These are all choices that used to be left to the parent, but not anymore. More and more today, the state regulates our children's safety, hygiene, and health. What's even more troubling is that this trend is having the effect of telling parents that they shouldn't trust their instincts, but instead should hand these pretty basic parenting responsibilities over to the government because the government knows better. Thanks so much for joining me today, Abby.
Great to be here, Julie.
I'm really excited to talk about these issues with you today. As you know, I write about these issues as well. I write about helicopter parenting and sort of the government getting involved in our food choices. So this really resonates with me, and I know that it resonates with a lot of our listeners and people who go to IWF. So you are just an exciting guest for us today. So first of all, I want to talk to you a little bit about what inspired you to write this book. You write in the intro, first of all, your book is fantastic. I read it in about an hour. I'm not kidding you. It was just a page turner. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
It is a series of, I loved how you integrated both personal stories and your own stories. You know, I think you and I know a lot of the scholars who write on this stuff, and so it was interesting to see you reference many of them, people that we know.
Right.
These were really compelling stories, but then you also dived into the nitty-gritty of the policy, which I thought was really important to sort of, you know, have real-life experiences contrasted with the policies that are creating this problem in the first place. So that's sort of my mini review of the book. I highly recommend it, of course. But you write in the introduction to your experience dealing with your child's daycare. I want to start off with that because I thought it was really fascinating how you know, this is, again, a real lesson in how the regulations put in place by the state often trump parent preferences. So tell us a little bit about your experience.
Sure. So really this book came out of both my professional life and my personal life. Personally, I started having children in 2007, and we have 4 kids now, and they've all gone through daycare, state-licensed daycare. We live in Pennsylvania, as you mentioned, and initially the rules that came home through the daycare, from the daycare, were really annoying but acceptable. I mean, it raised my consciousness about how much government regulations there are that affect really the daycare. Initially, it was mostly annoyances like you have to slather the kids in sunscreen, you know, sort of regardless of the weather. You have to, you know, cut up fruits and vegetables a particular way, and, you know, the list of how you're supposed to prep these fruits and vegetables gets longer. So my husband and I used to joke about how we would sing "Peel Me a Grape" as we were preparing lunches. So, you know, when you have fewer kids, you can joke and have time for that sort of thing. But then when our 4th child was born, our son, he went to daycare at 9 weeks of age, and by that time I really had a very low bar of tolerance for these kind of things. And I was asked by the daycare operator, so, you know, what do you want us to know about taking care of your son? And I said exactly one thing. I'd like him to be swaddled, wrapped tightly in a blanket, a la, you know, Jesus, for his naps, because that's how we are real believers, I would say. I'm a real proselytizer for Harvey Karp's Happiest Baby on the Block. Mm-hmm. And And we really found that with the other children, the way they became really good sleepers was to go through the same process of getting to sleep for naps and at bedtime, and that was swaddling. And the daycare operator looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, I can't do that. The state doesn't allow us to swaddle." And that was it for me. I sort of hit the roof. What do you mean? How is that possible? What's the problem with swaddling? And I went and looked into this. So the answer is that Pennsylvania, in its own defense, didn't actually ban swaddling. They went looking for a way of passing rules, safety and hygiene rules for daycare operators. And instead of doing the more complicated task of actually talking to daycare operators, they went and found a handy-dandy little guidebook, little, really not so little, that was produced by a group out in Denver, Colorado. This group has the imprimatur of the Health and Human Services Department because they got a grant to produce these guidelines. And according to these guidelines, which include a whole bunch of rules, that the swaddling is not medically necessary. That's the decision that the American Academy of Pediatrics came up with. And since it's not medically necessary, they don't advise it in a public daycare setting. So what I found, the result of this work, I took my private indignation over his not being able to be swaddled, and I went and I did sort of put my professional hat on, and I did the research, and I found that really this is just one example where daycare is made very expensive. Why is that? Because there are all kinds of rules about like no swaddling that are put on the daycare operators. They include regulations about the safety regulations like the placement of hooks, how far apart hooks can be, because those are OSHA. That's a totally separate department of the agency of the department that looks into safety at public facilities. So there are all kinds of rules. Then there are rules about how many ratios between students or the kids and the daycare operators or professionals who are running the daycare. These ratios mean that you can only have certain number of professionals in the room for a certain number of children. That means you have to hire more people. These rules, each of them on top of one another, take time away from actually caring for the kids, and they have costs. As a result, what I found was that daycare is now extraordinarily expensive, more so than community college, let's say. You're going to pay more for daycare per month. Many families, if they will have to really extend themselves to pay for full-time daycare versus, say, when they're going to send their kids to college. If they're going to state college, it may be less to send your kid to a semester of college or a year of college than it would be to send them to full-time daycare. And so that's really where I started. And I decided that like you, I love Lenore Skenazy. I had been reading her blog, Free Range Kids. I really sort of appreciated all of these stories about parents who were so frustrated because they made a private decision and a police officer, a principal, a nosy neighbor got them in trouble with Child Protective Services because they made a decision about their own, about treating their own kids and how they were going to raise their own children.
And thank God for Lenore, because I think she's honestly like the best public servant we have out there in terms of reassuring moms. I wrote about my own experience with that, being chided by an FBI agent who was in the parking lot of my local grocery store, and I laughed because the first person I called was not my husband after this man yelled at me. It was Lenore. Because I was
absolutely right. Right. You have your one phone call. It's going to be to Lenore Skenazy if you get into this kind of trouble.
That's exactly right. I mean, I've talked to other moms who say the first thing they do is check her website or write her an email because she's become this sort of the patron saint of all baffled mothers.
And she's a clearinghouse.
She is.
That's right.
So I share with you. I'm quite the fan of hers as well, and thank God for her. And one thing that I think it's so critical though that you point out that these sorts of issues happen even before the kids get to school or daycare, right? Even moments,
right?
In the very first moments that you've had your first child, right? And this happened to me, and it happened to you. A new mom will face this sort of government pressure, and when I say government pressure, it comes in different forms. Like in this case, it was like the nurse, right, who works at a hospital, and like she's following like state procedures, right, that say that women now have pressure to breastfeed or not breastfeed. So, you dedicate a chapter of this in your book, and I want you to talk about why you think this issue, again, from the very beginning, why this fits into your book's theme. Why do you think this is an issue on the breastfeeding issue that's critical for women to understand it, particularly women who might be pregnant or, because I think sometimes people look at these books, whether it's Lenore's book on free-range kids or No Children Left Alone or, many other books that are written on this, and they think, oh, well, this is, I don't need to read this because it's a kid. But look, I think women even considering having children need to understand this. So tell me a little bit about the breastfeeding issue.
So the breastfeeding issue was interesting to me because I was a formula feeder. I had trouble breastfeeding, and I ended up formula feeding my daughter. But I could see culturally that there's a real, especially amongst a certain set of women, that breastfeeding had become sort of a mantra of this is how you raise a healthy child. And one of the things that I emphasize in the book, we were talking about Lenore Skenazy about this issue of independence and raising independent children. When it comes to this issue of formula feeding versus breastfeeding, I found, as I did in all of these areas of life, there are parents, people who have become real advocates for themselves and for others about the particular issue that they have come into contact with. And for me, what I discovered was on breastfeeding, a woman by the name of Suzanne Barston, who wrote a book called Bottled Up, became an advocate for this kind of refusing to bow to the pressure about breastfeeding. Yeah. Now, what happens in terms of the government is essentially the government now has its thumb on the scale for breastfeeding, as if breastfeeding is going to solve a whole bunch of various problems: obesity, asthma, eczema, and attention deficit disorder.
Yeah.
Right? So how this manifests itself is you can find it in, say, as you said, on a very basic level, you're in the hospital now, and a huge number of hospitals have, and I can certainly attest to this, I gave birth in 2007 for the first time, and then the last time was in 2010, and within that span of 4 years,
Abby, can I interrupt for one
Sure.
second and just say 4 kids in 4 years? You officially
sorry, I got that wrong. 2013. I apologize. It's 7 years. I was thinking to myself, that's not right. I have a child who's about to have a birthday. That's why I was focused on 2010.
I had my first child. I was honestly going to send you flowers. I had my first child.
I appreciate that. No, let me correct the record if I could. Just go back. 2007, 2013.
Okay.
4 kids in 6 years, a little over 6 years. So in that time.
I had 3 kids. I had my first in 2007 and my last in 2010, and I had 3 kids. And people think that I'm a robot, like that I could produce 3 children.
Right, you're a baby machine. Right.
You're even more of a. Okay, so go on.
No. So yes, I have no twins, no Irish twins. There. Yes, I just got the dates wrong. You'll forgive me. So in that time. Whereas when I first gave birth, there was lactation consultation available at the hospital, but there were also like swag bags of formula.
Right.
By the last child, absolutely no free formula.
Unbelievable.
And so the government, so that goes to like hospitals, right? There are public-run hospitals. Mike Bloomberg made a big deal about the fact that he was putting formula under lock and key at public hospitals. Yes. Oh, yes. It's under lock and key. And actually, this is another thing that I discovered when I did the research. Each time some of these subjects come up, people who ordinarily would say, well, I don't understand why you would say there's too much government intervention, right? They don't necessarily, that isn't intuitive to them, right?
Right.
But then you say to them, well, what about, hospitals in New York City that have put formula under lock and key like it's Percocet? Right? Like the same way that you have to get a prescription.
Yeah.
Right, exactly, right? The same way you have to get pain relief, right? Prescription pain relief is under lock and key, and they have to make sure that you're not like going to OD on the Percocet after giving birth. Same way they're putting the formula, because God forbid you should be like, addicted to the formula, right? But so that's at the city and state level, right? There are cities like New York and Philadelphia. There are states that have they want to get the World Health Organization has come up with this whole formulation of the baby friendly hospital, as if places where maternity wards weren't baby friendly in the first place. So now they're and the definition of being baby friendly is to encourage or pressure women to breastfeed. Then you have WIC. That is like food. It's a government program like food stamps, but it's particularly for women having babies. And the WIC program now will give you longer food benefits if you breastfeed.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
Versus if you're... Now, it is also providing, by the way, low cost or even free formula. That was historically what it did, because the idea was that the women it was providing this formula to were not going to be breastfeeding. Now, everything has gone 180 degrees, and the idea is that we have to try and work very hard to get all women on the breast, basically, to get their babies on the breast.
It's fascinating. I breastfed all my babies, but I have to say, like, gosh, there's benefits to both. I don't want to be like one is so much better, because I think in some ways, not having a million bottles to clean was kind of, because I'm like, that's obviously like keeping things tidy is a challenge for me. And so I was like, oh, thank God, no bottles to clean, less like dishes. But then also, I had to sit. Like, I had to sit down, and like I couldn't. It was like, it's like a pain in the butt. And so I know you also, like, early when they can't hold their own bottle, you have to sit down when you're bottle feeding. But anyway, so here's the
thing, Julie. You and I having this conversation, like, we can have this conversation and say, and you could say to me, Abby, I really think breastfeeding is much better, or I could say to you, Julie, the bottles are nothing compared to the fact that I could hand the baby off to my husband and he could he could feed the baby. But here's the thing: why does the government have an opinion? Right. That's the problem I have. Like, I don't think the government should have an opinion. And WIC and the hospitals aren't the only places where the government has an opinion. Obamacare. Sorry, go.
No, I was going to say what's also fascinating, though, is that the government contradicts itself, which, I know, shock, but they contradict themselves. So I write a lot, and I want to talk about this briefly if we have time, because we could just talk about the breastfeeding issue for hours. But when you write on the school lunch program, okay, the government, like, when they talk about this, they say, the demographic that this is geared towards, which is poor kids, which we know is mostly single-parent families, okay? So they say, like, these parents are too busy to feed their kids, right? They can't, like, make a lunch, which I think is such a horrible thing to say. Like, yes, slapping a piece of turkey between two pieces of bread is really difficult. It takes so long, right? Right. But, so like, dumbing down expectations. But then they expect poor women who have, like, because they always say, like, they have 4 jobs. They expect them to be home and breastfeeding their children. Like that apparently poor women have, like, that are on WIC. They have time to do that, but they don't have time to make their kids a lunch. I mean,
Well, I think that this is exactly. Yes, I mean, this is exactly a problem that runs through all of these issues because, as you mentioned, the school lunch program. So there, you're absolutely right. It's not only a matter of time, like the government saying the people we're trying to help. I mean, This is really, it's all about, so the government saying we're trying to help. Right? We're trying to protect, we're trying to support, and so I agree with you entirely that this is a complete contradiction, right? And it's also a very good, it's also a question that I think we don't talk about, right? The basis of WIC, right, and food stamps in general. I mean, we want and not even government support, the safety net support, but in general, right? We think the fact that women entered the workforce en masse is a good thing, right? Capital G, good thing. Right. So we don't actually say there are consequences to that, right? We don't actually, as a society, say, okay, if we want to make it as fair and equitable and easy as possible for women to work as much as men work, well, then we have to actually have government policies that support that theory. Right, and you're absolutely right. The government policies do not support that theory, and I think also the question of breastfeeding and the school lunch program goes to another point that I try to make in the book, which is the government. The control issue is very important, right? We have a one-size-fits-all solution, and we're going to impose it on everybody. Right. And then the other part of it is this notion that just because people are in a lower are poor or are the working poor or are in a more disadvantaged economic position, they can't be trusted. I mean, this is the part that I find very, and this is the part that I think is also very important. It's really important to understand that what we're talking about is not just happening to one segment of the American population, right? It's not just happening to white women in Northwest Washington. It's not just happening in the cities versus urban or suburban versus rural or suburban areas. It's really happening across the board. It happens to single mothers, it happens to two-parent families, it happens to fathers, it happens to mothers, and that's really why I wanted to highlight not only the problem, but all of the parents who I have dubbed Captain Mommies and Captain Daddies who are really trying to fight. They sort of get mugged by reality, right? They may not think of themselves as advocates for themselves or anybody else. They may not even think of themselves as being very different parents from anybody else. But then this thing happens to them where they come into contact with some rule, some situation. The school bans or reduces the amount of recess. Right? The school comes and says, you can't do cartwheels on the playground. Right? The playground has a sign, no running, or they take out the swings, or there's no sledding. Right? Then you get people who otherwise, think of themselves as law-abiding, or they don't think of themselves as real rebels, and they say, "Wait a minute, this is my decision," and it's also one of the things that I found so interesting about doing the research for this book is that really you're talking about a whole swath of people across America who, when this encounter happens, find themselves on the wrong side of the law, really. Right. And, I want to talk a little bit about these, just expand a little bit on these unintended consequences with these programs. And, what frustrates me is that, again, let's talk about when we talk about unintended consequences, let's talk first about the intentions. Like, what was the intention? And the intention of the school lunch program, for instance, was to give kids who are living in very dire circumstances. The original intention of it, like in the 1950s. Now, the school lunch program goes way back to the Depression. They were kind of shuffling around commodities to schools to provide kids with a meal.
but it wasn't really officially authorized as a government program until the 50s. But, when it was authorized, it was supposed to serve the poorest kids, right, to give them one solid meal a day, right? And who can object to this, right? Who can say, like, okay, well, there really is this need. It's sort of a safety net. Like, there's a need, there's a definite need. And I think for I think for a lot of people like us that are sort of critical of big government programs, like, there's sort of a misunderstanding. Like, we're not saying that let's do away with it entirely, but, like, let's return it to its original intention, because what's so frustrating is that it expands. So it used to be just directed towards the poorest of the poor, the kids who really desperately needed it. And then before you know it, right, you've got 30 million kids every single day that are eating school meals, and almost a third of those pay full price. In other words, they don't qualify, which means that they don't live even close to they're like, I always call these kids the ones whose parents want to hit the snooze button a couple extra times because they don't want to make a meal. And look, I make 3 meals in the morning, you make 4. Like, it's kind of a pain in the butt, but you do it, right?
Right.
And so
here's the thing. I mean, I think that the other thing that's problematic, and I totally agree with you, the reason that these were initially instituted were very good reasons, because there was real deprivation, right? There was real hunger,
starvation.
There was starvation and deprivation, and you really and this is something that the government does well, because it says, look, we have access. Right? They're in schools. So we have them in the school, and we're just going to add this element that really is very important. Now, what it's come to mean, though, is that the National School Lunch Program now, because of the risk factors of a percent of the population of school kids, now puts every school child on a restricted calorie diet.
Right.
Now, not every kid is at risk for these health crises that the school lunch program is trying to solve, right? But it does have to follow a very broad model of what is a healthy diet.
Right.
So as a result, you've got a lot of kids who probably shouldn't be eating this kind of a diet for a variety of reasons, right? If you're a school athlete, you actually need more calories. You need more carbs. If other children actually need more fat, and the government is really against fat. Now, this would not, of course, it wouldn't be a problem if there didn't need to be one diet for everybody.
Right.
And so this is really, the Native American population in this country, which many of the children are on government benefits and programs like WIC, like food stamps. Unfortunately, that is the reality. There's a huge incidence of lactose intolerance in the Native American population, but there's a mandate for milk.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whether it's there's for cow's milk in these government programs. And here's another complication. The government is trying to balance the services it's providing, right, the school lunches, with its need to intervene economically in agriculture, right? So the U.S. Department of Agriculture has very different competing interests at work. They want to maintain dairy prices. They want to maintain the cattle and meat prices, because these industries are very large, and they also are, sort of plugged into the government system.
Pork.
And as a result, and pork. So as a result, look at what happens. The USDA, if there's a problem, a couple of years ago there was a huge drought, and the cattle farmers were saying, we're going to lose our herds, and we are not going to be able to, the market is going to just drop, the bottom is going to drop out of the market. And so the USDA came along and said, okay, we're going to buy up all of the meat. But guess who gets it?
Right.
The schools.
Right.
Because they've got to distribute it.
Right. I'm so glad that you brought this up, and like sort of other industries that sort of weigh in on this and impact this. I mean, ultimately parents and children are affected, but really it's more than it's not just the government that's kind of creating these things. Industry is also a part of this. But the other side of it, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit and take it away from the subject a little bit away from parents and kids and talk a little bit more about industry. And because I one thing I really appreciated about your book is that, you talk about the nannying's effect on business. You talk a bit about this in your book. Specifically, you talk about the Consumer Product Safety Commission, right, which is this agency which nobody seems to know exists, right? I love, because I also write, as you know, I write on things like GMOs, and I write on product safety, like chemicals and preservatives in food and chemicals that make products more durable. And there's all this, and you hear the environmentalists all like wring their hands and say, oh my gosh, these chemicals in these products and everybody's going to be poisoned. And I say,
yes, you've done amazing work on pink slime. on the
Yes, I am pro pink slime. I can yes, I'm very proud of that. But I will tell you, but people seem to think that like their local CVS and their local Safeway is just a wild west that a business can put something on the shelf. It's like Homer Simpson, how he puts the iridium rod in his pocket and goes home,
and walks home, and he goes home,
and, people think you can do that you can put something that literally is leaking toxins into the store aisle, and nobody's going to stop them. There's no regulatory architecture there that protects consumers, and so I was interested that you brought up the CPSC. But it's interesting. Okay, so again, the CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, is charged with overseeing products that are put in the marketplace and to make sure that they're safe. But they also have the authority to pull products off the store shelves. But so this is all good, right? Great. There's this agency there that keeps us all safe. But it's gotten absolutely absurd, the types of recalls that they have requested. And again, part of it is they're being pressured to do so. But tell me a little bit. I'd love for you to just give our listeners a couple examples of some of the absurd things that they pulled off the shelf. And then if you can also, I know that you recently wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about this as well, about an IKEA dresser that got pulled off shelf. An IKEA dresser that right now is in the next room over from me in my children's room. If you can talk a little bit about this agency, what it does, and what kind of the absurd actions we've seen out of the agency recently.
I'd love to. So again, much like the school lunch program, this is another agency. It was set up in 1972, and the idea sounds terrific, right? They're supposed to be protecting consumers, that is, informing consumers about unreasonable hazards or unreasonable safety concerns that might lead to injury or death. Right. So initially, you were talking about a very small, relatively small agency that's now got a much the budget has ballooned and its mandate has ballooned, and this happens in a lot of government agencies where the bureaucracy sort of it seems like it's as if it's organically expanding, and one of the ways that it does that is to expand its mandate. So now, So there are certain things that you can think of and say, oh, the CPSC does a great thing, like concerns about lead, right? So something they did last year, which was, I think, a very good thing, was there's a shipment of toys from China, and they found that the levels of lead in these toys, in the paint, were too high because the standards, if there are standards in other countries, are going to be different than ours. And they said, the toys are not coming into the U.S. Okay, great. But here's the thing. They, the same year, last year, they recalled nearly 200,000 teething toys shaped like a monkey because the tail of the monkey could cause a child to gag, right, or choke. Potentially. That was the thing. Now, here's the thing. There were no injuries reported with this toy. Right? And I'm thinking to myself at the time, I was like, hold up, my baby sticks his fingers down his throat. Like, he also gags on his hand. Like, are we going to ban the hand? Like, they're going to ban his hand. Like, I just found it sort of, like, ridiculous, right? Then there was a bicycle last year that they took off the market, a small number that they said, but you got to think, like, if they're taking this, 100 or 500 bicycles off the market, how many do you think the company made? right? Like the company is you're trying to get a kid's bicycle off the ground. You make, you have the money to make a few hundred. Then the government comes along and says, no, they're gone. Why? Because the handlebars could become unstable and a child could fall, if the handlebars become unstable. Did the handlebars become unstable? Did a child fall? Did someone call the Consumer Product Safety Commission and say, my kid got hurt? No. Nothing, right? And this is the part that I find that I found so amazing about reading. And here's the thing: it's like an anxiety factory over there at the Consumer Product Safety Commission because they send out weekly recalls. And I got a sister-in-law who, when her children were younger, I hope she's not reading them anymore, but she used to send me, she would contact me, forward me this email. It's really amazing how many ways the government manifests itself as the worst helicopter parent in America, because this is really the thing. We've now sort of turned the corner. I really think we have on this idea that parents should be overprotective, right? We see that there's harm that comes from saying your children can't do this and your children can't do that and don't go here and don't go there, right? But the government is worse than any parent in America because it says the bicycle handlebars could become loose, and then it would become unstable, and then the bicycle could cause the child to fall, and there might be an injury when none of this has ever happened.
Yeah.
And this is where I say, how is it the government's business? How is this an unreasonable risk, right? How is that an unreasonable risk of a product? And the results are that the companies have to swallow the costs.
I want you to expand a little bit on that. I think you touched on something so important, that this is changing us culturally. That
right.
We kind of. I've been hysterical listening to you. It's so funny about my children sticks his hands down his throat, and should we cut his hand off, because this could be a danger. I wrote in my book. I wrote a book on similar subject. I touched on helicopter parenting,
Absolutely.
and I talked about how you have this pressure to put labels on every kind of food, right? So hot dogs, there was pressure from a pediatric association saying there should be a warning label that it could choke, and even on grapes and anything that's sort of the size of an esophagus, right? And I was like,
right.
what happened to parents cutting things up or actually chewing, telling a child chew.
Yes, teaching your children how to chew. Yes, chewing is important.
Chewing used to be this was the guarantee that you did not choke, right? So
yes.
I don't what happened, right? And so I do honestly think we are becoming. There's these articles out there that talk about how technology makes you more dumb, and it's true. I now cannot get to certain places without my iPhone because the map. I need the map.
Right. I have a cousin who's dependent on Waze. She says that's the app that's changed her life. So yes, I totally get that.
Yes, and people don't memorize phone numbers. I make myself memorize phone numbers because I'm terrified of being without my iPhone and not having a phone number. So, I think it's interesting. I think this is there is a similar phenomenon going on where parents have become sort of incapable of doing certain things, or things seem harder. Do you agree with that? Are we what impact has this had on our society as people? Are we more reliant on the government? Just give me kind of a sense of that.
My feeling is that the part that we don't, Jennifer Senior wrote this really amazing book called All Joy and No Fun.
Yeah.
And Hannah Rosen at The Atlantic has also written about these issues when she wrote about playgrounds and playground safety. And they both hit on something that I think is very important and which you're describing, which is that the level of anxiety among parents about doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing is really out of control. And truthfully, it's a struggle for myself, and I think for most parents that I know, not to worry too much, right? And not to be overly concerned about possible dangers. Lenore also talks about this, that we have worst first thinking, right?
Yeah.
That we assume the worst is going to happen just because we think we know what the possibilities are, but we don't know what the probabilities are. And this is the thing that I think makes these government sort of mandates worse, because we think, all right, so maybe I have crazy anxieties. All right. But we're talking about the government, right? They're supposed to be cool and collected and very rational and scientifically based, right? We're assuming that there's some kind of scientific or very objective analysis that went into the decision to say the IKEA dresser is a hazard, like is going to kill you, right? It's going to kill your kid. Now, unfortunately, there actually were children killed because the dressers collapsed on top of them.
Yeah.
Absolutely tragic. And as I write in the piece in the journal, I wrote about the fact that this actually happened to us. My 6-year-old had the drawers of her dresser, her IKEA dresser, pulled out, more than one of them, and it was unstable, and she pulled on one of the drawers, and it collapsed forward. It fell forward. Now, she was 6, and she's nimble, and she, thank God, jumped out of the way, and it was just a very horrible sound and very, very scary. But we were extremely lucky. But guess what? I didn't throw out the dresser. We turned to my daughter and we said, okay, this became unstable because it was misused, right? And you use it as a teachable moment. I mean, thank God we were able to do that, right?
Well, and also,
the government can't do that. The government doesn't do that. The government just says, no. We're gonna say it's this. We have to protect the children, and in so far as they think that's even possible, right? In every case, they enact rules to say, well, the consequences of this decision, that it might hurt a private business, that it might actually not prevent any harm coming, it might not prevent anything, seems irrelevant. So the cost, there's no cost-benefit analysis, which I think every parent does, and you come down on the whether the risk-reward balance is worth it to you in every given situation, right? But the government can't do that. They just make a one-size policy, and then it's once it's implemented, the consequences, they could be very far-reaching. And for some companies like IKEA, that they can recall 36 million dressers. Right, well, they may be able to swallow that economic impact, but there are many other companies that cannot.
That can't. And there's an additional consequence to this, which is your daughter now knows that, because let's face it, IKEA is not the only producer of dressers, right? There are many other, and these are sort of, for like the person who's lived under a stone and doesn't know what IKEA is. But I mean, there are certain segments of the country that don't have IKEAs. IKEA tends to produce lower cost furniture items, so it's great for kids.
That's the point. They're affordable.
They're affordable, and it's great for kids because if you have kids, you know that they break things and you need to constantly replace things, and they get bigger and you need bigger things. And so I love IKEA for that reason, because you can go and get things that are affordable. And so but they're not the only producers of this. And you think about the lesson that your daughter now knows is that no matter who produces the dresser, no matter what, there are other dressers. Just don't use a dresser in that way. Make sure that you're putting in one drawer while you pull another out. Now, I will tell you, Abby, actually, that also happened to me with my children. The exact same story. My kids were nimble. They jumped out of the way. It crashed. It scared them. We put brackets on the back. Now, we looked at them and said, you can't ever use a dresser like this. We did the same thing. But then we took the added step of putting the brackets. We nailed it into the wall, essentially. But just like you said, no government person, there's not going to be a government person who shows up at your door and says, knock, 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 I heard you had a dresser accident. We're going to put these brackets in the wall.
Well, it's not only that, it's even worse than that. The fact is that first of all, we're in terms of IKEA. There was a spokesperson who said that this particular issue we haven't had in any other country. Why? Because they actually provide wall brackets with these dressers, and in every other country where they're sold, people actually install them per the manufacturer's warning correctly. But here's the part that I find really frustrating. So the Consumer Product Safety Commission, in many cases, will actually work with the companies that they are targeting, because they say, well, we're going to help you make this product safer by warning labels.
Yeah.
How come it's if the Consumer Product Safety Commission, that is the U.S. government, has said, all right, we're going to try this warning label. If the warning label fails, why isn't it the Consumer Product Safety Commission's fault?
Right.
They are the ones who demanded the warning labels, and the warning labels failed. Right? And this is exactly what happened in the case of the IKEA dresser. It happened in the case of the Bumbo, a baby seat. These are products that were on the market. The government said, we need a safety, we need a warning label, we need a dozen warning labels, it needs to be in this size type, it needs to be in this color, and then, an accident happens, and that's the other thing that we have to remember. These are all accidents. Nothing is intentional, right? Nothing happened that was meant to happen, obviously, and yet terrible things happen. They're tragedies. The question is, can the government actually reasonably prevent these accidents? And the answer is no. And as a result, it's actually, I would say, it's in the interest of these agencies to manage expectations, and they don't seem able to do that, right? Their idea is they're maximalists as opposed to being minimalists. And that's another problem, because it sends a very different signal to parents, just as you were saying. Why should it be that reasonable people should need to go on a website from the Consumer Product Safety Commission to look up whether the teething toy they purchased for their baby is quote unquote a hazard or not? Right. You make your best guess, and you are not, and within reason. That's really this is something that I quote. I quote Philip Howard a lot, because he is an advocate for regulatory reform, and this is something that we find a lot, that I found a lot going through this book, that in terms of the breastfeeding mandates, in terms of daycare regulations, in terms of consumer product safety rules, in terms of school rules and playground safety, these regulations have costs, and they become unreasonable. The regulations themselves have an unreasonable expectation of what it is to what is safety and what is hygiene and what is health.
Abby, I have to say, I think you are so important, such an important, reasonable voice on this matter. It is absolutely critical that this be exposed, that the sort of culture of alarmism when it comes to parenting, when it comes to raising kids, be exposed. And your book is such an important addition to, I think, a really important conversation that has been ongoing. And you have really, I have to say, I'm kind of, I know that we could go on and on about this, but I do have to wrap this up. But I will tell you, look, to anyone listening, we haven't even touched the surface of Abby's book. She goes on to talk about specific school statistics, that there have been some regulations put in place that are really, really harming our kids. She talks about the war on fun. I think this is one of the most important chapters of the book, because, look, we forget many times, I talk about this stuff, Abby talks about this, we mentioned Lenore, we talked about many other writers that write on this stuff. And what is so often, we talk about the economic costs and how it's making kids sicker and how it's making, parents more frustrated. But what we often forget is that it makes parenting harder. It makes it less joyful. We wonder why we have plummeting birth rates in this country. It's because who wants to be a parent when it's no fun? So Abby talks about that. She talks about the obesity police. I mean, this is a really scary topic. We have several problems in this country, and one of them, there are many tentacles of this issue. But obesity is certainly something that we shouldn't deny is a problem. But are the government programs really making it better? I think I would contend, and certainly Abby does, as many of these programs are making it worse. So I cannot recommend, I want to say the name of the book again, No Child Left Alone, Getting the Government Out of Parenting. Abby, I know the book comes out in August. Where can people find your book when it comes out?
Well, so you can order the book from Amazon. You can order the book from Barnes & Noble. These are online. If you go to my website, which is captainmommy.com, you can get a link to ordering the book there. And I'm sure I'm looking forward to seeing it in actual bricks and mortars bookstores as well. So that'll be, those are the easiest places, either Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com or CaptainMommy.com.
Well, I have to say, too, in the introduction, I feel really bad I did not mention that Abby is also a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum, so we also post all of her writing, so it's a good place, sort of a collection of her writing is also there at IWF.org, so check it out there, and we will also have links to her book there. And again, her own website. And Abby, I mentioned some of the writings that some of the magazines that you publish in. If you can just tell people again some of the places that you publish.
Sure.
They can also.
Sure. I often my stuff is found at the Weekly Standard, at the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, the Wall Street Journal, at Reason, and also the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, where where I've written political commentary.
And you also write great stuff for Acculturated, which I love.
And Acculturated, yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. That's the fun stuff.
Yeah. Well, Abby, honestly, I don't really want to hang out, or don't want to hang up. I want to keep hanging out, and honestly, I can't believe this is my job to talk about this because I have so enjoyed this podcast, probably most ever.
Me too.
It's been a really great conversation, and again, to everyone listening, please make sure to check out Abby. Don't check it out, buy it. Abby's
please.
book. Abby's book.
Purchase is consent, Julie. Purchase is consent.
Purchase, and also I will tell you, it's really a good book for new parents. So if you are, if you know someone who is thinking about it or is pregnant, I think this is an excellent book, particularly for a baby shower. Also, look, it's coming out right before school starts. So if you want to
so for the next school year, 100%, that would be that. I think get yourself prepared.
I think all parents should take this should use this book as a refresher course and how the government will try to tell you what to do. Abby, again, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you, Julie.
Well, this has been another edition of IWF's Working for Women podcast. For those who listen, thanks for your time. You can find out more about this topic and many more at IWF.org.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or stop by IWF.org for similar content.